Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Code and Connor podcast. My name is Connor Deeks, CEO of CodeStrap, and I'm joined, as always, with the original CodeStrap himself and CTO Dorian Smiley. We're going to be bringing you guys the latest and greatest around Palantir, the tech, the company, the community. We'll also be discussing insights on other companies, things happening in the world of AI, of consulting, of investing, and any meaningful topic that requires attention. The focus of today's episode is Palantir in North America. We'll discuss the Palantir-specific labor market, where Palantir can grow in Canada, Canada and the US's AI mandates and strategies, and lessons from the field. We're joined today by Chris Atack, who is the Chief Operating Officer of I4C Consulting and founder of ForgeSight. Chris is a strategic sales and marketing leader with 20 plus years of experience in business development, marketing, and business intelligence, and obviously with the clear foresight to establish an entire practice around Palantir. Brett Adams is a forward-deployed engineer at I4C focused on Palantir implementations and previously worked at Jacobs as a solution architect, with Jacobs being an official partner of Palantir and a large customer. Chris and Brett, welcome to Code and Connor.
Awesome. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. Good to be here.
First topic on the docket is the Palantir Foundry Labor market and the crazy competition for anyone and everyone who has used the platform. So I'll kick it to you guys to start. What are you guys seeing, particularly in Canada?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll start with our journey, I guess, Connor, in that, we went the opposite way, looking at the resources that were available in Canada first, kind of getting an understanding through that of who the clients were of Palantir in Canada, beyond the public sector where we knew sort of some of the penetration in that area. We quickly found out there weren't many. So there was about 450 that we had initially identified. And from that, we went through the 450, quickly became a number around 60 people that we would consider potentially deploying on a project as a consultant or hiring as a full-time member of our practice. After some deeper technical interviews, we cut that number to less than 30. So that was kind of the baseline that we were looking at, thinking of how we do things on the I4C side of things, looking for people with that expert level proficiency in a particular platform or software tool, along with the soft skills that would enable them to be truly a consultant within an organization or a deployment that we were working on. So if we compare that to like Salesforce or Workday or some of the other platforms that we routinely do work in, very, very small universe. So it puts pressure on us in terms of hiring right away. So less of consulting, more of hiring and making them a part of the full-time members of our practice. And then also looking at other avenues to develop new talent. What's the right skill set? What's that foundation? Then that creates the ideal, forward deployed engineer or deployment strategist in the future.
So overall, you came up with how many people that would potentially be hireable to do this?
Well, it was less than 30 out of 450. Granted, of the 450, we reached out to everybody. Not everybody responded. So we talked to about 2/3 of that universe. Some of them, of course, are with Palantir. And at that point, we were on our journey to becoming a Palantir partner, which we are now. So we didn't want to rock the boat and go and poach Palantir's people. So the best people, arguably, in Canada were already with Palantir. The next wave of people were with Palantir clients, who, of course, are also potential future clients for us in the future. So some challenge there as to, okay, are we going to engage these individuals or hire these individuals? Because ultimately we're hurting at developing a potential customer relationship down the road. So whole bunch of factors went into that, but about 30-ish, a little less than 30 that we were comfortable with hiring. And we started making some offers. Brett was one of the first offers that we made early in that cycle. And we're in the process of continuing to build the team. Some of those 30 we've lost to US competitors, so other boutique firms like I4C. And that actually leads to one of the challenges, or one of the points that I wanted to make on this, which is the cost of talent is going up as a result of that. Scarcity, of course, means individuals that might have been making $90K with a Palantir client are now making $150K, $175K, $200K. So, an individual we might have hired 3 months ago at $150, their price tag's gone up about $25K or $30K on an annual basis already. We're facing quite a lot of pressure because of the exchange rate, Canada versus the US. $130,000 salary in the US is about 175 Canadian. So, puts a lot of pressure on us in Canada in particular, There's a counterpoint to that, but from a talent acquisition perspective, that is a challenge for us.
The number of actual competent resources with Palantir experience globally, right? So you have Palantirians and ex-Palantirians, but many of those people don't want to be service providers or consultants. Many of them, if they leave Palantir, go and start their own company. And there's a number of other reasons why the pool gets smaller and smaller, but it's maybe in the hundreds globally that are actually available resources that potentially could do service work.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it as the cohort of people who are ready to be hired to do senior level work, that pool is relatively static right now. And so trying to sort of court that group and poach them from other resources is the only option right now for companies, because it takes years to grow a senior Foundry developer. You can't just produce that overnight. And even with the AI tools that are coming online, like forward deployed engineers that are these AI virtual deployed, forward deployed engineers from Palantir, I would argue those are primarily senior developer tools that need to be deployed to basically amplify the value of the people who know what they're doing. Putting that in the hands of a novice is a recipe for absolute disaster. I don't care whether it's Palantir's AI FDE or OpenAI's ChatGPT or whatever. And we see this across industries too, where like even if you look at law, like some of the law firms we know and talk to will not allow associates at their firms to use AI for good reason. They need to learn how to become good lawyers, right? So like there's a big difference between reading what ChatGPT tells you is an answer to a question versus doing your own research and understanding the law and being able to give quality work back to the partners. And I think that's probably going to be what we see the sort of net out across most industries, is that for younger associate level talent, these are not appropriate tools, which is the exact opposite paradigm you kind of want to see for this labor shortage market solution. Like if the idea was AI would bridge this gap, you would want the exact opposite to be true. You would want like all of the junior people to be using AI or outright replacing them, right? But you can't do that. So I think we're in this unenviable situation for senior talent, and the best we could do is probably amplify the value of the current senior talent. So like, what are the ways in which we deploy them? How can they bolster and improve and help accelerate the learning journey of the junior talent, and also provide automation, maybe not in the form of AI, but traditional automation as well, that can help make the teams more effective and guarantee quality as an outcome when they're trying to learn where the guardrails are. I'd be interested to know, Brett, like, what's your experience right now? Are you getting people hitting you up on LinkedIn all the time and being like, "Hey, your skill set looks amazing. How would you like to join this company?" And are you going to use this information that Chris just gave you to renegotiate?
Maybe, but no. There's been a few over. I've been with I4C since the beginning of April, more or less. So I've had one, maybe two recruiting firms that have reached out. Just even I think there was one asking about how we can how can we identify these people? And obviously we're not going to give away all the hard work that Chris did to get this set up, but it's certainly correct to say that, there is that skill gap. And then to kind of go off what you were saying, Dorian, about not giving junior people access to AI, when I was at Jacobs, we actually saw it like slightly differently, where we thought we could use AI to actually get younger, say, junior engineers, actually help them turn into intermediates quicker. So you can imagine if you're a junior engineer out on a site, there's a lot that you have to do. There's a lot that you have to keep up with. You're going to ensure that work is done correctly as per specifications. You're writing reports. You're making sure that health and safety is where it needs to be. If you can have AI tools that are specifically made for you, and in the Palantir mindset, if you can have that one junior field engineer going to many different sites over the day, they can become infinitely more valuable. And then you're also giving them the tools where if you have an entire ontology of previous projects, you can lean into that, and you could look at it from the perspective of, this is how we expect a report to go to a client. We can help you like find previous similar things, so you can start doing more, and you can be confident that this is the way that we as a consulting firm or construction company expect things to be done. So maybe using it a little bit differently instead of just relying on it, but using it as a tool to help you do your job that maybe didn't technically require something that you learned at university, for example.
That's what's interesting. we talked about this last episode, Connor, where ring fencing SMEs could be super valuable for CEOs right now because um, the SMEs might be the force multipliers and the things that really take advantage of automation and AI tooling first to amplify the value of like everyone else in the org. It's also where you might see labor reduction around SMEs. So like a ring fenced SME team that is good with automation and AI might require less direct reports and less people under them to get to the same level of outcomes. Um, but would be interested, Chris, to get your kind of sense on this. Like, are you thinking at all about as a as a business leader, how do we think about our AI strategy in terms of talent retention and planning for this future where maybe the SME resource is super valuable because it helps train and keep the model on rails as to how the business should actually function?
Yeah. So our staffing model is very focused on acquiring more senior level SME quality resources for our team that we can deploy on projects. But the idea is that they're deployed on multiple projects, multiple clients, to your earlier point of how can we scale them. Um, Kind of similarly to what Brett said as well, the goal with juniors, because we are hiring at the junior level, we're putting at least juniors through our training program, is get them to be intermediate as quickly as we can under the tutelage of the senior. And then from Palantir's perspective, this was something that came up in conversation last week. Their view was hire more of the deployment strategist skill set as opposed to the forward deployed engineer skill set based on where their product development will go. I think you get different points of view on that within Palantir, but that was an interesting point. And, I look at our training program right now, we have 25 people in our first cohort. Of those, about 2/3 would be forward deployed engineers, a third more of the deployment strategist skill set. So we may have gotten it wrong if Palantir is right in terms of the mix of that. But that's sort of the track that we're on right now, having that kind of blend still of the two skills that you see inside of the Palantir ecosystem, Palantir world.
Connor, do you want to just touch upon real quickly, like the difference between like your experience with the deployment strategist versus the FDEs, and do you have any thoughts on like what would the reason for the guidance be?
The deployment strategist is really there to work hand in hand with the business to make sure that you directly unpack the problem statement or the capability they want with the technical solution actually performing the capability to get to the outcome. It's not so much like a unique skill set, right? Many consultants can sit with the business, unpack the problem statements. But what you need to also have is a deep understanding of the platform itself, such that you can direct how quickly or what tools you're going to use in platform to get to the outcome. And then the forward deployed engineers in very rapid fashion deliver the solution that captures the outcome. What I see, or what my opinion on deployment strategists is that they need to be industry specific and likely have functional experience. So if you're going to unpack a problem statement in a manufacturing client that deals with procurement or working with suppliers, you need to know how that actually works. Because if you bring generalized knowledge, it just, well, one, your client can directly see you don't have experience in that domain, even if you have the technical chops to potentially unpack it quickly. But with that domain specificity or that functional specificity, with the way that you construct the solution will then be directly applicable to your client. So a deployment strategist is really about being business forward with business acumen and unpacking that problem statement while also having technical acumen to know how it's going to be solved. And then the forward deployed engineer is the one that go ahead and builds it.
Yeah. So I think Palantir's point there is that deployment strategist skill set's going to be more important as the platform evolves more away from or utilizing AI to do some of that hardcore technical work that traditionally humans would have been doing. I still think there's going to be a reliance on that too. So if anything, the two roles kind of blend together and you're looking for, I agree with your industry specific comment that industry specific experience, even if they've had experience on tier deployments in multiple industries, they get that industry, but also technical enough to build within the platform.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's interesting that the deployment strategist kind of figures out the Foundry shaped way to solve for the business problem, and then these FDs coming to build. I am way less bullish on the idea that AI is going to fill the gap here. I do think automation, traditional automation, like they're building with the platform SDK, could help fill the gap more substantially than the AI. Mainly being like my background as a platform engineer, we used to build the platforms that the product teams used to build product, and that was our job. This is before AI, right? To act as a force multiplier we primarily built on AWS, but we would use the AWS SDK and APIs and Terraform and traditional automation technology so that engineers didn't have to think about like, oh, I'm building an eventing system. What do I build for my eventing workflow? How do I deploy that on AWS? And we would just offer that as a platform service that came as a Terraform script or Terraform a module that you would just config in your project. You have this like little config YAML in your project, and that would deploy the necessary resources, right? That sped up teams tremendously. And so if you have that for Foundry in the form of the platform SDK, where you can get away from ClickOps and platform, and now you have like a rich set of Terraform scripts that are going to deploy and manage those resources for you, that's huge. And even if you think about things like Workshop, or if I could just describe Workshop in like a YAML file, like a simple YAML, or had a CLI tool to help me build in Workshop, or could script it myself, I think that's like another way you could build force multipliers and even like custom workflows. Maybe I want to build my own workflow for AI that's looking at a sketch of a Workshop module and would use the CLI under the hood or something. But I think that for the most part, the traditional automation is yet to hit Foundry, and that could be where we see the biggest like gains in terms of automation, or platform, like basically Foundry platform engineering teams that build these automation tools for Foundry that rapidly speed up the deployment and management, especially ontology hydration. And like there's the Make SDK from Palantir now that is meant to do ontology as code, where you can like hydrate an ontology from these descriptions that they're building in the Make SDK. And then you can what's neat about that is if you think about starting from a project and accelerating the delivery, is that if you can agree on the shape of the ontology and you define it in the Make SDK and you write the scripts to hydrate it, your teams north of the ontology can start building a Workshop, while south of the ontology worries about hydrating the real thing. And now you get this like acceleration just because of that, which is kind of neat as well. So and then being able to standardize on common ontologies might further accelerate, where we don't necessarily need to build the whole marketplace solution necessarily of a product end to end, meaning like traditional marketplace app, I've got the data transformation pipelines, the ontology, the Workshop applications, etc. Maybe the thing that is really fundamental is that we all agree on the shape of the ontology. We build that from the Make SDK, and then that unblocks both teams to go build whatever the concrete implementation is for that particular customer or whatever. So I'm much more bullish on platform engineering to accelerate, and maybe there's a component of AI in that than I am in the AI for deployed engineering approach, but happy to be wrong there because it'll help us if I am. Like either way, it's great. But yeah, no, I'd agree. And one of the interesting things here is like the importance of the senior, even thinking about this new future where deployment strategist is more important from Palantir's perspective to invest in, to drive that sort of unpacking the business, shaping things, is this idea that the SME on the FDE side, because that's the person who's most qualified to work with these tools, becomes ultra valuable. And so maybe there is something here where we're bridging the gap by a combination of platform automation, AI tooling that then takes this SME who's, the FDE with 3 to 5 years experience, is full stack Foundry, and now is acting like 10, FDEs at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I could see that happening. But Brett, I'd be interested in your take as an FDE. Like, what do you think the future of these AI tools are? Are you more bullish or skeptical on the AI FDE and like role of platform engineering here from your perspective?
Yeah, my first thoughts of what it would do is maybe even blur the lines between an FDE and a deployment strategist just a little bit more, with the caveat that it allows you to do, like as with all technology, allows you to do more with less. So I was speaking with an old colleague and saying that with the drop of the AI FDE, if you're originally trying to schedule or put 3 to 5 devs into a client's project, maybe you only need 1 to 3. And if there's a lot of some of the initial legwork that an FDE would be doing that is more or less produced in a skeleton form, so that you can go and do the details such that it matches what the business wants to do, then it allows you to bid on even more work. So that was my first reading. Not to be scared. I know there's a bunch of people that now they're exacerbating this whole, oh, AI is coming for our jobs. But no, it's still just, we're on this pathway of, if you don't know how to use it, then that's more of an issue than what it can potentially do. So I'm looking at it the perspective of us as a smaller company. We're able to go and bid on more work. We're able to use our resources more efficiently. If we can have, say, someone like myself on multiple deployments, and then an actual deployment strategist on even more deployments, I just think that's a net benefit.
Chris, how does that disrupt your hiring plan, right? Because if you are looking for junior developers to go after the traditional paradigm where it's more pyramid in structure with junior devs under more experienced ones, do you potentially abandon that if the AI components of what Brett's talking about really flourish? Because then you'd just be looking for the Bretts of the world, the more senior developers, and not looking to like upskill the next generation or get the next generation of talent up to speed.
Yeah, we're still going to do the latter, but our focus on hiring right now is absolutely at the more senior level. Obviously, the more expensive, harder to find level, but in that conversation with Palantir around, kind of where to focus was last week. So I've had some time to think about that, but that was kind of the path we were on anyway. And I still think having that senior for deployed engineer skill set will be important. But then let's look for the soft skills, the business experience in combination with that. That would also enable them to become more of a deployment strategist with the forward deployed engineer skill set in the background. So that's kind of the focus for us. It may mean that we don't need to have, 50 people by the end of the year or, by June of next year, whatever the case may be. Less of a focus around headcount, more of a focus around skill set that we can scale quicker. That's better for us anyway, and better for our clients because we can deliver for less.
I'm a little intrigued at this idea of the blending of the deployment strategist and FDE because it mirrors our strategy as a company. Like we pair a senior software engineer slash FDE with a sort of we call them platform leads, which understand a business, like a sector really well, and in particular industry really well. And the idea being there is that we could build forward-thinking solutions for that industry, mostly aligning on like what would a foundational ontology for that particular group of customers, cohort of customers that this platform lead is servicing look like, and almost build things ahead of time. And so I'm interested in kind of unpacking a little bit, like if the role of the deployment strategist starts to sort of bleed into the traditional FDE through the use of maybe things like the Make SDK to define a foundational ontology and automation around the hydration process, is it could you further accelerate things and also improve outcomes for the customer through like focusing on this deliverable of the foundational ontology, the sort of data model that could solve 80% of the overlapping problems for a cohort of customers, and then you only have to fill in the 20% instead of going to like each customer and looking at that as an individual snowflake and have to tailor a solution that's exactly for them. Because my general experience is that if you are aligned with a cohort of customers who are generally doing the same thing in a given industry, there is a huge amount of overlap in that Venn diagram, whether it's the foundation, the systems of record that they use, the processes they implement, or the challenges they face. Huge amount of overlap. Foundational ontologies might start to solve that. So I'd just be interested to get your guys' take on that.
Yeah, we agree. Actually, Brent and I have had some good conversation around this with respect to Kavanaugh. You guys talked about on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. Maybe Brett, if you want to expand on your thoughts there and kind of the construction / manufacturing space and the overlap even between those two industries.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess I do have a background in engineering consulting and construction, so that's more so my way of seeing the world and thinking. But when you take, just to use the Kavanaugh example, you take a look at their company, they're fully vertically integrated. They have all their own quarries, their own repair shop. They, for the most part, do all their own work as general contractor, sub out where need be. There's elements in that vertical integration that there are other companies and industries which can pull through. So I know Joe and Jesse talked about the dispatch that they recently deprecated a previous software. Now all the truck ordering takes place within Foundry. That's something where if you want to take that foundational ontology for dispatch, then maybe you start looking at, okay, this is a construction company, but embedded within it, there's also this entire dispatch. So can we start looking to take pieces of what's been built, find companies that would be interested in having this deploy for them to help their business? It doesn't have to just be the entirety of the foundational ontology. It can be bits and pieces. So there's certainly, and then for manufacturing, I think it'd be more of the same. Delivery, dispatch, there's a lot of overlap between a lot of these industries in which we're working in.
Yeah. And another example, we're building something for a wealth management firm today, and another wealth management firms in our pipeline. We're having a similar discussion with them. The use cases are exactly identical. So like, why would we charge for this twice? We could actually just build this once and make it easier on the second one, or join them together. They can pay for it together, because, to your point, other than some customizations of differences in systems being utilized in both cases, the outcome that they're looking for is exactly the same.
And also partnerships, like having a large SI partner that has, like, let's just take Accenture as the prototype, that can, especially at larger institutions, manage the hydration process from the standpoint of like hooking the source systems up to the target ontology. That tends to be a challenge that is less technical and more relationship based, along with you have to jump through a lot of hoops. I'm at a large customer now, 3 months going in to try to get access to the data. Nothing to do with, once you get access, you're off and running, but it is a large institution to navigate.
Yeah.
And so sometimes these bigger SI players can make great partners. And then beyond that, there's the other partner in the room, which is government, which has a lot to say about some of this stuff as it relates to AI. But maybe Connor, if you want to lead in a little bit about the discussion around the policy here.
Yeah, so we're always talking about how AI can make us more efficient, more performant, and then its role in the future of business process. And that's one side of the table, the people that want to use it. But then, like Dorian said, government plays a role here. So there's both mandates, action plans. So love to kick it to you guys to talk about what you're seeing in Canada, what the role of any type of mandates or restriction or strategy that Canada is deploying to either hinder or make companies and pushes like you guys are doing more successful.
Yeah. So in Canada, as you may know, we had a prime minister change earlier this year. In March, they rolled out the what is it? Canada's AI mandate, name of the program, announcing 2.4 billion of funding for programs. So not just technology, but programs related to AI within the government. Each of the departments have also been challenged at the same time to cut expenses, so up to 15% anywhere outside of defense, because of course we've also committed to increase our defense spending by 5%, aligned with NATO's pledge recently. So everyone else is searching for savings and efficiency at the same time. So obviously, AI tools to reduce some of the low value activities that people within the government would be doing are kind of key to that. And so government leaders within various departments in Canada are going through that exercise right now of where could AI play a role? What tools could I possibly use? And we're kind of stuck. I think the last stat I heard was something like 67% of systems being used in the Canadian public sector would be referred to as legacy systems. So a lot of old clunky tools that are being utilized, Excel spreadsheets being utilized, even with some real high value use cases that we're aware of. So it's kind of ripe for Palantir from an opportunity perspective. But the challenge, of course, is like unification of data, departments playing well with each other, even though it's in their best interest to do that. What else? The ability for even just unions within the government to accept these changes and the impacts that they may have on people. All of that is kind of up in the air right now, based on those job or the expense reductions that I referred to earlier. There's a forecast of up to 57,000 job cuts within the federal government over the next 3 years in Canada. So all of that is, going to be widely debated, I think, in Canada as to, is AI replacing people? Is AI making services better for Canadians? What's the right path? Who should we use? Is it a US-based software firm? Is it a Canadian-based software firm? Lots of different things going on in Canada right now on that front.
What role? I'm curious. Sorry, I was just curious the role the provinces play. Like, here in the U.S., we have a patchwork of legislation across the country. States are working on some of it is positive, some of it is negative, but in many cases, companies engineer for the lowest common denominator. So, like, if California passes super restrictive AI policy, everyone in the US starts building around the most restrictive policy, not the least restrictive. So, like, these states can throw a wrench in the equation. Now, I know that I think in the US AI action plan, there's some attempts to try and address this at the federal level, but do you have this same problem in Canada where, like, provinces can implement a policy that then force the industry to adopt a more restrictive approach? Or
Yeah, different provinces have different legislation around various things, like simple things that we face every day. Laws around traffic enforcement and things like that could be different in Ontario than Quebec. A simple example is you can't turn right on a red light in Quebec, but you can in Ontario. So provinces for sure have some element of control when it comes to kind of key services that Canadians interact with. It would be healthcare. Healthcare, which I know we'll probably talk about further on this podcast, but healthcare in Canada was deemed to be the greatest opportunity for Palantir to solve. But it's distributed through the provinces. So there's Health Canada that oversees delivery of, but all the delivery is provincially dictated and executed. So to sell, Foundry as a solution, like with the NHS in the UK or various use cases in the US, you've got to do that province by province and win province by province to do that.
On the US side, certainly with the administration shift, we went from a focus on making sure like AI was safe and addressing risks, even before it was really mature and rolled out. The stat from the last podcast was only something like 2% of enterprises have any type of production AI solution. So addressing safety before adoption was an interesting approach. And then with the AI action plan from the Trump administration, we have a flip on the focus, making sure that, like, or at least the action plan is that the US will lead AI, the US will lead the software and be able to package that up and essentially sell it to our allies and around the world. And then a big push into the infrastructure that would enable AI to proliferate. And then you have the whole initiative with Doge to reduce job functions. But I think the biggest push for AI, at least on the US governmental side, is to reduce the red tape such that more and more players that are likely going to be AI enabled or AI forward can compete for governmental contracts. And that could be in the healthcare space or the defense space. But I think that's where we're going to see the biggest push of AI is if we can bring the regulation down, companies can more easily compete. We'll just compete on margin if they're AI forward.
in the US, there's this concept of the US stack for AI, basically. And at the foundation layer, you have like the chips. The layer above that, you have the models. The layer above that, you have the end software solutions that are going to be delivered to enterprises and customers. Palantir's in that last mile, kind of tier. But the idea around the US AI action plan is to do everything it can to make the US stack the premier predominant AI stack in the world, and to do everything it can to protect that asset. So there's both elements of protectionism. There's elements of accelerating innovation. It mostly reads as a focus on investment in the infrastructure layer. Like, if I go through the action plan, the vast majority of the points are around building out this infrastructure layer, building out the energy sector that's needed to power it. Like, it just really is focused on that. But also there's elements in there to try and get to make sure that we, quote, win the AI race. And part of that, I think, is getting widespread adoption of the US stack powering the majority of the AI workloads. I'd be interested if Canada has a similar idea, or if, like, Canada sees this as a partnership with the US on the infrastructure side, or is Canada also actively looking to develop its own infrastructure with Canadian companies, or largely trying to build on top of the work that the US infrastructure companies are doing?
I was at an event targeted to government a couple of months ago, and it was really just highlighting for government leaders different AI tools that are Canadian made. One of them being Cohere, which is an LLM that was created here in Canada. All the data resides here in Canada. So the discussion around that one was interesting because it had to do with data sovereignty and political influence on LLMs. Looking at obviously OpenAI in the US, DeepSeek in China, and I forget the presenter's name, but the presenter did an interesting demo where he used DeepSeek and asked about the Tiananmen Square incident. And the response that he got back was quite interesting. Certainly not the truth that, all of us who may have lived through that, would understand ourselves. So he's using that as an example of, look at how political influence may actually impact the outputs that you're getting from various artificial intelligence tools, which was an interesting eye opener, I think, for the audience. I think Canada's more so looking at, when we're thinking of government in particular, use a Canadian solution first. If that Canadian solution meets your needs, for sure, that's definitely a driver. As we always are, trying to innovate and be leaders in that regard. Although we always have a talent drain from Canada to the US as well. That's been commonplace in technology for years. But try to retain Canadians and focus them on, things that will have meaningful impact on government and private sector here. And then again, back to data sovereignty, make sure that we're protecting ourselves properly, particularly in the world that we're operating in today. And perhaps, hopefully it's more short term, but the short term blip that we have in our relationship with you guys south of the border to us. So
Does data sovereignty mostly center around where data physically resides? Like it should be located in Canada, or is it something else?
it's both. It's definitely where it resides, but also who has influence on the platform.
For me, the most exciting, like we think about the idea on this American stack, the last mile is literally the platforms and software that deliver 90% of the value, like almost all the value will be extracted in the last mile of this stack. I'd be interested to get your take because, like, for me, that's where all the most interesting things we can do as smaller companies are. Like I can't go out. I'm not going to build GPUs. I'm not going to go compete with NVIDIA. I'm not going to build an L foundation model that we're talking billions of dollars in investments to do that. But small teams can do tremendous work using those other two layers to deliver the value, right? To actually build this engineering around the infrastructure and LLM layer. That's where Palantir has given us a lot of tools. But Brett, I'd be interested to get your take on, like, what are the things that you can do and that the teams can do in that last mile layer of this stack to sort of innovate and provide competitive advantages, et cetera.
Yeah, I think to go off what Chris was saying, if there is a push to be using Canadian products and then also keeping data sovereignty here, then I think that really speaks to the benefit of using a platform like Palantir. We all know that if the best way to get a more accurate result out of any LLM is to constrain it, and what better way than to just run it off your own ontology? So if you can go to your client and say, this is only going to be looking at what we give it permission to look at, and you're going to specify in some form or another, this is all it can look at. So I think that's one of the ways, at least getting people more comfortable with, okay, yes, we're going to be using something that's Canadian born and, the data lives here. And then furthermore, this is how we can ensure that not only is it Canadian, but it's accurate. So then you can meld the business case, but then also, keeping investments here.
Connor, I know you've been dealing, what's interesting here is both the US and Canada seem to be very pro adoption of AI. They're doing everything they can to try to get to find ways to grow the economy, reduce government expenditure, like really leverage the tech. Connor, you've been working in Europe a little bit with some of our partners there, and there seems to be the opposite mentality there. Like it has literally been like, no, you're not using it. I know you've had interesting conversations with people there who are trying to figure out how they even develop an AI strategy in Europe, and maybe contrast that with what's happening there.
Yeah. Well, one of the major benefits of AI is efficiency. Yeah, when you deploy it, when you get accuracy, when you can control it, and it doesn't end up just being a black box that actually kind of folds in on itself. But every single person we've talked to over in Europe, whether it's Switzerland, Germany, actually the only holdout might be the UK, holdout being trending towards the US and Canada's approach, is that because you can't actually realize the benefit of the efficiency, largely because of regulation or unions, right? There's really no semblance of being able to fire anybody. That there's way less, and then there's the regulation, the insane amounts of regulation on a continental level that is being put in place is actually just making people kind of push away from the technology. Now, there's certain companies that are not in that cohort, but what we're seeing is basically apathy towards the technology, and with the very few holdouts really pushing the envelope. And that's largely just because of the regulation. Um, and that's really going to bode very poorly for them, because if the US and Canada and other countries that are not regulating themselves out of existence during a technology revolution, um, they're in trouble, because we'll compete in every single industry on a more advantageous level, because we can drive costs down, we can manufacture more quickly, and then there's probably even industries that maybe we were competitive with before, but if we are able to drive out the cost of back office functions to the point where we're focused directly on, as an example, if you're in manufacturing, on the manufacturing of the thing, and then we even inject AI into that world of atoms, then they're in trouble, and they're worried about something that is, at least in my opinion, an afterthought. This is happening. AI is real. There are many companies adopting it, and so you can't really look the other way and expect to be in an advantageous position, because your competitors and competitive countries are using the technology. So in Europe, I think they're currently in trouble with their regulation, the roadblocks they're putting up for themselves, and least of which is the perception or the misconceptions about Palantir being a data company. Yes, they do serve the government. Yes, they do work with secret agencies around the world, and they're not a data company. But if you anchor your opinion of them on the fact that they are a data company, that they are harvesting the data of certain enterprises or governments, then and that's a really hard misconception to break for people, then they won't even be able to utilize the technology. Dorian, we were just talking to a friend over there who is now considering pulling out their investment in and around Foundry. And that could be for various reasons, potentially cost. But, if you're starting to give away the technology stacks that can leverage AI effectively before there's even more than a few percent enterprise adoption in AI workflows, then doesn't bode well for the continent.
I've heard directly from Palantir champions at large institutions that they've received lots of blowback just related to the negative perception of the company. But the thing I think that's very interesting here is that the service obtainable market, the SOM for Palantir or for Canadian and US companies, may expand as a result of this, right? Because if you can fundamentally compete with better margins, better outcomes that are largely driven by technology, then you can capture more of the market. And those geographic barriers that used to exist may be less of a competitive advantage than the proper use of technology moving forward. And that's the real danger that Europe faces, I think, as they're essentially handing over the market to the people who are going to adopt and use these tools. And I think the US and Canada both have been very clear-eyed about, like, hey, if we don't use this, our competitors will. That's just the bottom line. And at the end of the day,
We even see individuals over in Germany or Switzerland basically picking up the phone and calling us, going, "Hey, can we work with you guys in your U.S. enterprise?"
Yeah.
Because what we're seeing here, we know these tools are not just profound, but they're actually extraordinarily interesting to work with, and they don't want to be left behind. So, like, they're picking up the phone saying, "Hey, can we come work with you guys?" Or, "Hey, who do you know in your network that's looking for talent that would be willing to hire out of Eastern Europe or Germany or France or Switzerland?" So that, I mean, it's anecdotal, but it's showing that there's already pent up anxiety about being left behind here.
Yeah, for sure. Well, just make sure to tell them that, I foresee in Canada, ForgeSight. Hey, Canada, we're happy to do.
in addition to that, like as we talk to these companies and bring people in or starting to look at AI as a way to improve their business, capture some of this service obtainable market that's opening up to them. How do you think about readiness? Because like a lot of the challenges we see at companies don't really have to do with the technology. They're often structural or embedded in the organization. And so be interested to get your thoughts on like, how do you approach this readiness problem, figuring out which customers are really ready to adopt a platform like Palantir, but also think about how they're going to change their operations, embed AI at the center, all these type of things we've been talking about.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of factors. I think the number one thing is the organization ready to make a full-on operating shift in their business, or are they looking to incrementally solve small problems? Um, we look at things, of course, like data maturity within the organization. Although, there's a good example, the Kavanaugh story, where if you were just evaluating data maturity, you would have said, okay, well, this is not the right platform fit for that client. Turns out they're going to be a model client for Palantir. So that on its own isn't the answer. But they were also ready to make that huge operational shift because they knew they needed to do that to become more competitive in a challenging market where your margins are on average 2 to 5%. So if I can make that 6 or 7 or 10%, I'm going to be way ahead of the competition. So we look at factors like that, the culture within the organization. We need champions. So is there an executive champion? But more importantly, I think now is finding those champions within the business that really push underneath. Palantir comment. I was in a meeting with Palantir earlier today, and they commented that they're seeing a lot more of that in the sales cycle, where it's people at the bottom end of the organization pushing for, hey, let's talk to Palantir. I think it can solve our problems. And we've seen in a few use cases here, one obviously Kavanaugh, a couple of others in Canada that aren't public, but it's individuals that are not technical that are solving problems with Foundry. And so they become the champions as well. And they're working with the technical teams to solve those problems. And that creates a lot of momentum for additional use cases within the organization. Um, Ontology fit obviously is another one of those things in terms of readiness. Like, can we all agree on what that should be? A common data language. Do they understand their business well enough to represent it digitally at the end of the day? uh, a capability. It's good for us as a consulting firm if they have no one who can be there for years doing the work, but it's likely not going to succeed if they don't have the right team internally, ultimately to take over from Palantir or us as a service provider. So making sure that they've got the right structure in place, the right type of people in place that we can work with and support as we go forward. Those are kind of some of the keys, but Brett, I don't know if you had anything that you would add on to that from your experience.
Yeah, and I think this actually ties neatly into what we were talking about earlier in terms of how quickly is a tool like AI FDE going to rapidly improve. So I look at it from the perspective of this opens the door for more private companies, family-owned businesses, which might not have enough money or capital to be able to afford right now a Palantir, not even partnership, but just can we get on the stack? I know that if I can get onto the platform, this can help transform my business. This can give me a leg up over my competitors. And so if these tools get a little bit better, then okay, the price tag has reduced significantly if we need less people to be on it, or I can afford a longer engagement to get started with. And so if that happens, and then you can cling on to that executive who's going to be pushing it from the top down, but then pair that with some of the end users who believe in what is being done, then everybody's rowing in the same direction. And I think that is a good way to, get embedded, a little bit more.
Chris, you mentioned like it's coming from more of a bottoms up or maybe middle up.
Yeah.
That's the prototypical person that I see that really gets Palantir over the hump from a license perspective, but also the proliferation of the capability across the organization. There's one or two or three heretical thinkers, that people that fundamentally want to innovate, that aren't just looking at the problems they've faced, but actually want to then solve those, that are really shepherding the platform into existence and convincing people both above them at the executive level to write the check, and then younger people below them to follow in that journey. One thing that I don't like seeing is that then the executives take all the credit and don't support that person, but that's a different topic. But I think that's the person that people need to latch on to, both consultants as well as internal people, as well as Palantir, because it doesn't take a huge amount of people. When you focus the attention of the software and the technology on core business problems, that leads to large return on investment that then funds the journey. But if you can find those heretical thinkers, that's really where you can strike gold.
I was just going to say one of the challenges that we see in some cases is Palantir will go in through a door and they're solving a problem, but it might be on, let's say, the operational side of the business as opposed to maybe the commercial side of the business. And there's two political forces internally battling over, well, why is so much money going to this thing over here when I want to do this thing over there? So for us, in addition to kind of finding those right people, Connor, it's also what's that use case that has, cross-functional application. It may not be necessarily like the most important one to solve, but in terms of gaining momentum within a client, if we can find something that kind of touches the majority of departments or portions of an organization, deliver wins across the organization. Now all of a sudden you have people asking, hey, can you solve this problem? Can you solve that problem? And you're off to the races.
I think a huge part of the adoption is, especially when it comes bottom up, is you have to build a coalition. Like it's great if a director sees the potential of Palantir, but that director cannot sustain the platform in the organization. Especially if you look at the spend trajectory of every Palantir customer, you will quickly get to centimillions in 5 years if you're rolling this thing out through your organization. That is not a check a director can write. And so if you don't have a broad coalition and support behind it, which involves both like, how do I bring in more people who can benefit from this, kind of like what you're hinting at, but also we see this other set of voices in organizations who are very nervous about AI replacing them or, making their job irrelevant or whatever it's going to be. And so I think there has to be at the top of the organization and this coalition, some willingness to, or some messaging around that lets people know what their role will be in the future if we use AI to automate these functions, and that you still have a home here, but your role might be slightly different. But that's like executive leadership that has to be crafting that message. So I think this all points to like, you need a coalition that goes all the way up to the top of the org. That could be hard to build. And part of being a good partner is like, how do you help those visionary thinkers who might be at a director or VP level, like build that coalition, think about all of these things that come into play, which is both the cost trajectory of where this is actually going to end up, the fears that other people in the organization have about their spreadsheet or their job. We have one of our friends gives a great talk about how like some people love their spreadsheets more than they love their significant other. So you want to be incredibly protective about the things they're doing for the organization. You need a strong coalition that can overcome all these things. So I think, part of being a good partner is like building that at the end of the day.
You see executive messaging here, and I'd love to hear what Brett, you and Chris see. At least in the US, we're flipping pretty quickly from the carrot to the stick here in the in our country, where it was like, hey, you can pick up these tools and they're there for you. Now it's like you will use AI in your day to day, otherwise you're in real trouble of employment here. There was obviously the shift back to be in person and in office. I think that might have then built the base of them being able to direct these types of strategic initiatives or strategic messaging, I should say, because people are together now. So now it's time to say, okay, now we're going to get back to strategic guidance here with technology as well. But what are you guys seeing in the US from a top-down messaging perspective?
In Canada, we're seeing exactly that to varying degrees. Obviously, in Canada, by our nature, we're a little slower to, enforce those sorts of things upon our employees. We're not as aggressive from a business perspective, perhaps culturally, as the US. But, you mentioned Shopify earlier on this call. Shopify had that directive to their employees. What was that, 3 or 4 months ago, I think, that became public. And we've heard that from other clients as well. It's becoming an expectation of employment, right? You're utilizing that to shortcut, even if it's just Copilot in your organization. You're using that to shortcut things that take you time that really shouldn't take you that amount of manual time. The problem, though, is a lot of that execution is being done without thinking about proper governance and so on. Pulling public tools, putting company information on public tools that they shouldn't be. So, back to the Palantir story as to why they should invest in a platform like that.
From speaking with friends, they ask, okay, what are you doing for work? And then I'd start asking them, well, what are you doing in your new day to day that involves AI? And I do have friends that work at companies where it's just carte blanche. There is no AI. It's not on browsers. It's not embedded into the Microsoft ecosystem. It's just, we're not using it. So I think that's to their detriment, as you were kind of mentioning with Europe as an example. But then I think this kind of goes back to, talking about scoping and getting buy-in from all levels of an organization. If you can find, so that when you're scoping out use cases and whatnot, if you can find a use case that it can be propelled upwards by end users, a director loves it, people at the decision-making level on C-suite, if there's an element of that you can clearly say, hey, this is built to purely make your life better, and it doesn't require it's not something that you needed to be trained for. This is not part of your university degree or technical education. So that can certainly help buy-in when it comes to, hey, this is not coming from my job. So I think that can help. It gives decision makers at the top a bit more confidence that, yes, I can be a little bit more, maybe not pushy is the right way of saying it, but if people have the confidence that this isn't going to come from my job, then you can start to, accelerate on the gas pedal. Like, hey, we're going to start doing this more and more because we know that you're not going to push back, because things are being built with the intention of not fully replacing you, but making your life better.
I always like to say, in my previous life, was, like I said, I ran platform engineering teams, and our customer were software engineers. And software engineers are notorious for being like super opinionated about the tools they use. If there's any defect in that causes them to slow down, they're going to let you know about it. And so, like, I would always say to my teams, like, hey, resist the urge to force people to use what you're building. If you try to force these people to use, these developers to use the tools you're building, that means you're not building good enough tools. Like, they should want to use them because they make their life better. To the point earlier about like how we're switching, you are seeing, I think, in a lot of the communications these days from some of the consulting companies that are studying this, that companies are mandating people use these tools. I happen to think that's reflective of shitty tools. It's like not that like people are dumb or not realizing how they can benefit from these things, is that we need to do better in building tools that make a meaningful impact. And I don't think that's Copilot. And I do think that this messaging also is driven largely by Microsoft, who wants to advance uptick in adoption of Copilot in the world's largest enterprises. They're literally going around, I have firsthand knowledge of this, going around and asking enterprises, why aren't you using Copilot more? And the general response is because it sucks. I don't like the product. Like, that's not a knock to say like Microsoft isn't doing anything amazing around AI. They are. They're especially at the infrastructure layer with what they're doing with Azure. Their ability to run these workloads in a supply constrained environment is second to none, in my opinion. But the point being is that if you want to have broader adoption, give people tools that make their life better, not ones that you say makes their life better, but actually makes it harder.
Yeah.
And so I think that's an implementation mistake at the end of the day. But I'm wondering, to get your guys' takes of if we put this in the category of implementation mistakes, that you're not building an AI tool or an AI system that actually is improving, like, what are some of these categorical problems you see in implementation, and where companies are like foot gunning themselves around rollouts?
Yeah, I think, and I'll pass it to you, Brett, in a second, but I think just to kind of follow on that point, we're talking about adoption of AI. Well, what AI tools are available? It might be AI within the CRM or AI within the ERP. And is that connected to other data sources that they really need to get the answers or the outcomes that they want by using the AI tool in the first place? So I think that goes back to, as you're saying, what tools are available in the environment, and how do you then empower your employees to use the right tools to, make the company more operationally efficient or effective. Um, so looking at sort of some of the major issues that we see, and of course, we're early in our Palantir journey. We started this process of becoming a partner about a year and a half ago. So we've learned a lot from existing clients, clients that are not ours, clients that we're now dealing with, some of our own mistakes along the way in terms of scoping. Looking at some of the existing clients where perhaps the use case wasn't as well defined as it could have been. or promises around the delivery weren't necessarily checked with the technical people first. So the delivery didn't end up being exactly what they thought was gonna be. So I think, we see those as some of those major challenges, making sure that upfront you do the work to truly define what the challenges are, evaluate with your technical people, can we do this? Is Foundry the right solution to solve this? And obviously it can solve lots and lots of problems. And if I were a Palantirian, I'd tell you you can solve all the problems. But like make sure we get it right, particularly if we're the ones delivering it. Um, looking at sort of the ontology fit again, we talked about that earlier, but can we build the right ontology that makes sense across the organization? We're going to get buy-in to that across the organization, so that long term, other than obviously, keeping it up to speed and so on, we're not going to have to rebuild that, which creates all kinds of problems downstream. Those are some of the kind of major factors that we see. And again, we talked about, the current employee base. Are they ready for this? Are they ready for that sort of transformation? Those are all sort of key factors, but right over to you.
Yeah, so I think it's two things. I know, Dorian, you mentioned earlier having, if the way that Palantir thinks things are going to go, where you have dedicated deployment strategists that are almost more sector focused, then that really speaks to, when you're trying to actually have a successful deployment is, one of the benefits that we all know about the way that Palantir does things differently is actually going and sitting with end users and getting their feedback of exactly what they do, what are their issues, and how can I help you? So to have previous experience or even just deployment experience all in the same sector, you're able to pair that with, sitting down with these people if you're doing a workflow in, say, accounts receivable, and what exactly are your issues? How can I make your life a whole lot easier compared to what it is now? And so companies that don't take that approach of sitting with people instead of just, okay, I have this product, I have this software platform, I'm going to slightly tinker it and change it for you. It's just the wrong way of going about it. It needs to be tools made for those specific people. If that's not the mindset, I'm sure it's quite tough. So
I love the feedback loop, that the FD model, and the way Palantir approaches this by sitting with the customer and finding their challenges. That's great. I think it's not a panacea though. And I would say like where it falls down often is in post builds. How does the customer maintain the solution so it doesn't fall over, for example, over time? Like one of the most infuriating and kind of bummer things that happen is to see a beautiful solution that's built, that's delivering value, but then the business abandons it because IT can't support it, and they can't afford to pay Palantir forever to support those things. And so one area that we often look at is, great, implementation's amazing, you're gonna solve some of your hardest problems, but what do you do when Palantir leaves? And how do you continue to have confidence you can run this and that IT will support you in it? And what is that going to cost you? Because it might be that IT comes back and say, great, we need, X amount of money to go train people to at least run it for you, because no one knows how to. So like finding the areas where there is room for improvement, and I think avoiding some of the mistakes. I think this problem of the solution falling over when Palantir leaves is one. There might be others, and like often there will be I don't want to call it over engineering, but there will be an engineering to spec problem where, like, they brought this up in Kavanaugh, where like there's an attribute in the database that some engineer came up with that tracked the type of paving people were doing. But like no one's ever asked for that. They just want to know that you're doing paving, like it doesn't matter what type, what type of rake you're using or whatever it is that you're doing. Like no one cares about that. That's just some field a developer came up with. And now we're engineering to spec as opposed to outcome. So I think that's probably another area where there's like misalignment and things, is like you should always be engineering to the outcome you want to see, not the legacy system that came before this or what the data model says. So it'd be interesting to hear your guys' thoughts on those two things.
I would add to it that a lot of the clients that Dorian, you and I work with, there seems to be a historical lack of willingness to challenge the enterprise architecture or the decisions that have been made historically. Good example was the tracking cost of what type of rake or whatever versus just the job of raking. But even just technical architecture design. So one example is the virtual table issue we went up with and the iceberg implementation. Like, if the business has no understanding of those things, and there isn't someone in the middle to maybe challenge the IT assumptions, then you kind of just keep going down the wrong route. But having open conversations with IT and with the business and maybe an intermediary of a consultant bears a lot of fruit. That's just kind of like what Jesse had talked about on the Kavanaugh podcast episode. But you need to know like both sides of it to kind of play referee there. But I think if you can get the IT and the business in the same room and be able to articulate why they've made certain decisions and why the business wants certain things, you can get to a faster resolution so that you don't over-engineer things for basically a pattern you don't really need.
Yeah, and I think there's lots of examples of that. I mean, Palantir, I think, generally sells to the business, not to IT. There's some examples of the opposite of that. But the challenge with that is now the business has made the decision to go ahead. And if you haven't warmed IT up to that decision, they're going to become a blocker in your implementation process. So that leads to some of those slowdowns and challenges. And then, the point you hit on earlier, Dorian, of enablement post Palantir or post I4C or North Slope or whoever, right? Someone's got to own it after we all leave. So, making sure that alignment's there early, I think is really critical. Involving them in the sales process is something that definitely we recommend. We are trying to do, although the business audience is the first one that wants to talk to us as well. There's that motivation that now knowing that, we're going to be leaving at some point and hearing all these stories of, okay, they left and now what? Mentioned earlier as well, kind of having those teams in place internally and training those internal people as to, what this all means, why we built it this way, walking them through the decisions that were made and why, and trying to avoid any of those questions that might pop up afterwards as to like, well, why did you do it this way? Those are some of the lessons I think early on again in our journey that we found. But Brett, anything on your side?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly correct. Because then if you have that heretical thinker, Connor, that you mentioned earlier, who is now also owning a tool for when, I4C or whoever is complete with the implementation, then more than likely that person, if they're already on this pathway of thinking the way they are, maybe their role turns into, I'm gonna be responsible for all these tools that I helped, create in the first place, and then I can be that resource internally to ensure that their continued setup for success.
Yeah, I think that's where IT becomes a key partner. And it's just like when you're building your coalition, if you can get IT in the fold and make them comfortable that like you will be able to run this when we're gone. We will automate the alignment with the risk profile, whether that's how we handle permissioning or how data is accessed by particular working groups or whatever it is. You want to bring your own encryption keys to stay compliant. Your audit logs are streamed into Splunk, like all these things that IT cares about. If you bring them in early and you make them comfortable that this is what we will leave you with when we're done, they become an implementation partner and you avoid the post-implementation fail. And then they come in as a blocker,
Yeah.
because then what they want to do is beat you up for all the things you didn't do when you ran and didn't consult with them on the implementation, which is their role. I mean, literally their role is to make sure the business doesn't footgun the organization by, exfilling go to prison data to people. Yeah. And so I think that's like, it's totally fair. It's a legit reason. And you need to partner with them. I think that the structural issue might be that, traditionally the business has outsourced the ownership of the data asset to IT, which it shouldn't do. Let's just give you an example. I'm the CFO. I want to own the financial data for the company. I don't want to outsource creation of the financial data asset to IT. That's insane. No, one, they don't understand exactly what I'm looking for, but two, like that line item should not be buried in $1 billion of spend. It should actually be way more visible. I should have direct control over the resources and how they're allocated. I want to be the capital allocator for the outcome, not a bureaucrat in IT that may be more interested in a 40% cost reduction of Spark jobs than getting me timely, accurate data, because I don't think the CFO cares about the 40% reduction in Spark jobs if the bottom line spend is $1 billion and the savings on that is 400,000, like, so there's just misalignment of incentives when you launch things over to IT. They might engineer for technical outcomes in an implementation versus like engineering for the fastest path to high quality auditable data that I can trust. And if that means I spend twice as much on Spark because I'm not spending time time not wasted, but time that is not related to optimizing for that, I'm more interested in the outcome. So be it. That's the CFO's decision. They own the data asset. They own the outcome. The technology should be the enabling factor for them. So I think a lot of times where we get this misalignment today is like the people who should be owning the data asset don't actually own the data asset. They've outsourced it to a group in IT, whereas like IT should own the risk profile of maintaining and delivering that data asset, but the CFO should actually own it, or the CEO should be owning the data asset they depend on.
Yeah.
That sort of decentralization across the organization can also help speed things up. That is also a common implementation mistake, is I see too much centralization in producing the ontology as a data asset for the company. There's this tendency to want to trend towards master data management versus something more like data mesh, or how do you build distributed teams that can then build on top of these data assets? So like something more like a traditional product team at a tech company. Those are small teams that are business led, tech enabled, and they own a product from start to finish. That same thing needs to exist in Foundry, where like you can leverage the underlying data sets in a federated model, build ontologies that align with the real world entities that the organization wants them to align to, but you have the freedom to produce n number of independent applications on top of those. That's a very decentralized model that avoids this centralized problem that we see. So I think there's two things that are driving this. It's, the wrong people own the data assets at the end of the day. That needs to be decentralized from a single org that's owning that. And then the other is that there needs to be a way to distribute the workloads among, hundreds of teams that would be building against this in a way that, the outcome IT wants to see, which is a high quality of data, all the controls in place to make sure data is only consumed by people who are allowed to see it. Those things can be automated in platform. And I think that's where Palantir really shines, is like, if you do want to achieve this highly distributed model, Palantir is almost an N of one in this space to be able to do that, in my opinion.
You have your federated data model, but then you have, essentially product owners of different workflows and deliverables, people assisting with that. So it's not that only that person touches this one product entirely and nothing else. There is a lot of overlap, but then you have people who have ownership of certain things. They aren't siloed by any means necessary, because as we know, a lot of these objects and deliverables, they're touching many different parts of the business, so you can't have it that way anyhow. But then you have the ability to, if I'm working on something and an output of what I'm producing is going to touch, 2 or 3 other objects and workshops, then I should probably have some form of involvement there as well, so that I'm not, I'll use your expression, foot gunning what I'm building, so that it doesn't screw over anybody else and we can keep moving forward. And having things set up in that way from the get-go, it just makes everything smoother, lives easier, and ultimately we're a whole lot quicker too.
One of the interesting headwinds we're seeing, even at where customers are successful with Palantir, is this. It's anecdotal. I don't have any hard research around this, but just this sort of scrutiny over SaaS spend, scrutiny over IT spend, the desire to want to take spend down where they can. I'm interested. Like, one of the interesting things here that I see with Foundry and adopting the model you're talking about, Brett, is that often the business can spin down SaaS products because really they were using the SaaS product to solve this very small, narrow channel of problems. And like, if you use Foundry to solve that, you get the solution you're looking for, and it's free. Essentially, it's baked into the cost of the platform. Now you have to obviously pay for the people's time to build it and maintain it. That ends up being a lot cheaper than paying the time it takes for the team that impulls the SaaS product over here. Like in a lot of cases, if you have Salesforce, there's a Salesforce implementation team at the company that, and then the team that is responsible for running the impl team will build custom solutions on top of it for the business. And then you'll have like the team that runs it. You can spin all of that cost down and shift over to your Foundry teams, usually at a much lower, cost per unit, because so much of the work can be done by citizen engineers versus the traditional software engineer. But then it can align with this push, maybe, in the sense that like we're seeing, at least anecdotally, a lot of people wanting to reduce SaaS bloat and spend. Foundry could be a great platform to do that. Foundry has its own cost trajectory and its own, spend trajectory, which isn't free. But I'd be interested to get your guys' thoughts on cannibalization, maybe that where Foundry can cannibalize some of these workloads. And are you seeing the same trend anecdotally among especially IT leaders are looking to like consolidate SaaS spend.
Yeah, it's been a common theme for us, yes, particularly with some of our enterprise level clients. We're also hearing the same thing from big four like Deloitte, PwC, and so on, mentioning the same thing that they're seeing within their client base, which of course tends to be larger enterprise as well. So I think particularly at that layer, it's being considered, which is more of the market for Foundry anyway. They're also being challenged to operationalize AI, and we've talked a lot about that over the last hour and a half. But how do they do that? With what tools do they do that? And I don't think many of them have good ideas or answers yet as to how they stitch all that together with their current ecosystem. And you referenced a few minutes ago, Palantir's sort of positioned to be the platform to do that in general anyway. I'm going to use us as an example. We're going through our own journey of building our company on Foundry right now, which is interesting, of course, as a partner delivering services. Now we're doing it for ourselves. And we're not looking at, a deep tech stack, of tons of different SaaS tools. We have a CRM. Of course, we use QuickBooks for financial, but that integrates with a SaaS tool that we visualize all of our dashboards and monthly reporting and all that kind of stuff. And now I look at, what we're building in Foundry and how easily we could replace the way we utilize a CRM. We also built an applicant tracking system. So how we use our applicant tracking system, or of course the dashboarding tool, and replace all of that just simply for us as a relatively small business compared to most Palantir clients on Foundry. Doesn't for us reduce a ton of cost relative to the cost of us paying for Foundry, but it unifies it all in one central location. Of course, that again, that's the whole idea of what we're trying to do with Foundry with our clients in general. So we are hearing that it's definitely a trend. I think again back to operationalizing AI, and we touched on this earlier, like AI tools within those platforms, ERP, CRMs, and so on. They may be great for that particular platform. If you're really trying to do that across your organization, then you need to make a change and consolidate.
Yeah, we're actually working on this right now for a potential client. Is what does an AI operating system actually require? And you could stitch together 45 or 100 different SaaS products and then hopefully try and maintain that. Or you can just use Foundry. It simply comes with most of the things that you would need. Now, there's always going to be certain components or microservices where you could consider another SaaS product. But man, how much history do we need to pile up here to show that investing in AI solutions on a bespoke basis across dozens, if not hundreds of SaaS products is not going to yield the efficiency gains we want? Do we need to go through before we look for an alternative? And really the market has showed us that the companies that are succeeding with productionizing any AI solutions, let alone an operating system to cover an entire functional area like supply chain, has really exclusively been a Palantir success story versus anybody else.
What's interesting there, and you touched upon it earlier, is like when you're engineering an AI system, that one of the key pillars that in order to get the right answer to a high value question, I need to give the model the exact right information to answer the question. And to do that, you can't just have the data that's sitting in silo A, B, or C. With SaaS Sprawl, that becomes a really big challenge. Like if you were going to engineer agents on all these various platforms that then data exchange and talk to each other, that sounds like an absolute nightmare. Versus import all the data and engineer it into the target ontology. And my God, if that target ontology is something that various sectors could adopt and there's pre-engineered, you could actually have people like us who build agentic workforces against those target ontologies. There's a lot of things downstream that can be brought in that you don't even have to build anymore. But you need a platform that lets you bring all that together. And there aren't many of those. I mean, if you think about it, there's Palantir, there's Databricks, there's Fabric. AWS has SageMaker and their offerings around that. But like I would argue, they probably don't have as good of a unified data platform as these other vendors. And the other advantage that Palantir would give you here is like Microsoft is trying to do this with Copilot, but they do it under the hood. They essentially like bring in all your data in a model grounding process that you don't control or have access to. And that is also dangerous because like if you don't know what went into the answer or how Microsoft did that grounding process, you actually don't have real auditability in the system. And even if they surface it to you, I would still argue you don't really have auditability in the system because it might be using synthesized versions of documents that are like summaries or whatever that you didn't produce, et cetera. But anyway, I'd be interested to get your take on expanding on that idea around like, yeah, you actually need to bring all this data together. You need to be able to give the model the exact right data to answer the question, but like your thoughts around like Palantir is differentiated in that space and maybe how it ultimately starts to deprecate the need for these SaaS products, especially as AI starts to come in the mix.
Yeah, I think it's immediately noticeable. When I was at Jacobs, there, as part of a team that we were exploring how we can do things better with different off-the-shelf AI products. So, there were people who were building just custom GPTs. Say, okay, I want to be able to extract this, or if I throw something in here, can you give me a base of a PDR or something where I need to create a report? But I think where the benefit of Foundry, and especially as it turns into a show me, don't tell me, is if you take something like a request for proposal for a road. Um, if this is a very large highway, not only do you have to process drawings, but then you have thousands of pages of specifications. This also touches in regulations. So there's a municipal way of doing things. There's also the provincial minimum requirements that need to be done. Once that's actually in construction and somebody out in the field has a question, the only way that you can reliably get an answer to that question right now is to open that spec book or look at those drawings. So if you have a tool like Foundry that allows you to bring in these documents and parse them such that you can reliably show in the field, hey, what's your question? Okay, what size pipe is supposed to be going in the ground right now? A lot of people, by their nature, are skeptical of these tools, and rightfully so. But if you can start showing them and building confidence that, hey, this is only looking at your exact job. This isn't looking at the job from 3 years ago down the street. This is what you're on right now. And you can even have a little session. Okay, ask any question, then let's go check the answer. So being able to do that versus some of the experience we had looking at Copilot or OpenAI, just those custom GPTs, it could be right. And it was hard to sell that. But then once you actually get a bunch of people in the room and you start running these sessions of, well, this is what this is the differentiator of Foundry. And I think this goes back to another thing we're talking about of having that bottom up approach of people saying, hey, this is really making my life better. And sorry, what's that platform called again? Oh, it's Foundry. Perfect. Okay, now I know how I can push this upwards, with even greater acceleration.
Brilliant. Only other point I'd add to that is, obviously Palantir is expensive, and that's no secret. So, part of this conversation around reducing SaaS spend is looking at ways to fund bringing Foundry into a business, right? So if you think about, that, I mean, obviously some of them are $100 plus a user. I don't want to pick on Salesforce, but I've been a customer on multiple occasions spending over $100 per user.
Oh, come on, it's okay. We're all we
Are we collaborating on a replacement for a series
where yeah, we'll pick on. So in that case, that's an easy target. When I think about the product that we're collaborating on, how we're going to utilize that in our business, how other businesses could utilize that for quite a low cost of zero if you're going to import it from marketplace into your stack. That's a pretty good starting point. Of course, we can build upon that, customize it for you. But it also evolves with your business over time, right? You're not bound by whatever the tech roadmap is for Salesforce or Microsoft or whatever tool that you're choosing to replace. You can replace that, maintain that yourself, and evolve that application yourself as a company. Then it's going to do what you want it to do, what you need it to do for your business when you need it to do it.
All right, guys. Today we covered the labor market around Palantir and the challenges there, federal, province, and state governments' impact on AI progress, client readiness for the Palantir platform and AI in general, lessons from the field and the impact on the SaaS landscape in a single company and on a macro level in the face of AI and platforms like Foundry. Thank you, Chris and Brett, for your time. Guys, why don't you give a plug on where we can or where our viewers can find you?
Awesome. Well, thanks for having us. You can find us on our website, i4c.com. You'll find our ForgeSight, Palantir practice information on the site, as well as contact information for us there. And of course, you can find us on LinkedIn.
Thanks, guys. This was fun.
Future episodes coming, more and more guests of partners, customers, content creators, Palantir, other tech companies, you name it. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.